Packard's final blueprint revealed a corporate betrayal, and honestly, once you understand what actually happened here, you will never look at the American car industry the same way again. There was a time when owning a Packard wasn't just buying a car, it was a statement that you had arrived, that you were somebody. Presidents rode in them, generals trusted them, old money swore by them, and the people who built them were genuinely proud of what they were putting on the road. So how does a brand like that just disappear? Not get outcompete, not slowly fade because the product got bad, but get deliberately walked into a grave by the very people who were supposed to save it. That's what we're getting into today, and I need you to stick around because the part most people never talk about, the blueprint part, that's where this story gets genuinely disturbing. Before we go further, if you've ever wondered why American luxury died the way it did, drop something in the comments because I want to know what you think after you hear this. And if this is hitting already, hit like right now because this story deserves more people knowing it. Let's go back to when Packard was untouchable. We're talking about the 1930s, the absolute peak, when a Packard 12 pulled up outside a building, people stopped and looked. This wasn't aspirational, this was a rival. Franklin Roosevelt rode in a Packard. The Soviet Union bought Packards for Stalin. You had Hollywood royalty, you had Wall Street, you had everyone who mattered choosing this car above everything else available. And the engineering behind it wasn't just good for the era, it was genuinely ahead of its time. Packard had engineers who cared, who argued over tolerances, who obsessed over refinement in ways that their competitors were not doing. The 12-cylinder engines they produced in that period were so smooth, so quiet, that passengers reportedly had to check whether the car was running. That's not marketing language, that's actual documented owner testimony from the period. Then World War II happens, and here's the part that should have guaranteed Packard's future forever. The British needed Merlin engines, the same engines powering Spitfires and Hurricanes, and Rolls-Royce couldn't produce them fast enough. So who did they turn to? Packard. And Packard didn't just copy the design, they improved the manufacturing process, tightened tolerances, built over 55,000 of those engines, and their versions were considered by many engineers to be superior to the originals. 55,000 engines that helped win a war. If you were building a case for why a company deserved to survive, that's your exhibit A right there. The brand equity alone from that contribution should have been a foundation for decades. And honestly, that alone should tell you everything about what kind of company this was before the suits got involved. But here's where the story starts turning, and this is the part nobody really sits with long enough. After the war, Packard made a decision that felt smart at the time and destroyed everything quietly. They introduced the Clipper, a mid-range car designed to compete with Buick and Oldsmobile, sitting below the true luxury Packards in price and prestige. The logic seemed sound: more volume, more revenue, broader market, the kind of thinking that looks good in a boardroom presentation. But what it actually did was begin eroding the one thing Packard had that no money could just manufacture back once it was gone, which was exclusivity. When your neighbor who drives a regular car can now afford a Packard, the guy who bought a Packard to be different from his neighbor starts looking at other options. And that's exactly what happened. The senior luxury buyers started drifting toward Cadillac, which had stayed disciplined about its positioning, and Packard found itself caught in the middle, not truly mass market, not truly luxury anymore, just somewhere uncomfortable in between. By the early 1950s, the company needed a move. Revenue was under pressure, the identity was blurring, and the industry around them was consolidating fast. General Motors had its full lineup locked in, Ford was reorganizing aggressively, and the independents, companies like Packard, Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, were all feeling the walls close in. That's the environment James Nance walked into when he took over as Packard's president in 1952. And look, Nance was not a fool. He understood what Packard was supposed to be. He had a plan to restore the brand, separate the Clipper completely into its own identity, push the true Packard back upmarket where it belonged, and rebuild the reputation that the post-war period had been quietly chipping away at. He genuinely believed he could save this thing. And for a moment, it looked like he might actually do it. Then came 1954 and the Studebaker merger, and this is the betrayal part, so stay with me here. The argument for the merger was that Packard and Studebaker together could create the scale needed to compete with the Big Three. Two independent companies combining resources, sharing production costs, surviving together what neither could survive alone. On paper it had logic. The problem was that the paper was wrong in ways that changed everything. When Packard's people did their due diligence on Studebaker's finances before the deal closed, the numbers they were shown did not reflect reality. Studebaker was in significantly worse shape than what was presented. Some accounts from people inside the deal describe it as numbers that were, let's say, arranged in a way that made the situation look more manageable than it was. Nance himself later said publicly that had he known the true financial condition of Studebaker at the time of the merger, he would not have proceeded. That's not a man making excuses after a bad gamble, that's a man describing being handed a grenade with the pin already pulled. What happened next was almost mechanical in how inevitable it was. Packard's cash reserves, which were actually healthy, started flowing into Studebaker's operations almost immediately to keep the combined company alive. The engineering budget that Nance had planned to use rebuilding Packard's platform and restoring its identity got redirected. The separate Packard production facility in Detroit, the one that had built those legendary cars, got shut down in 1956 as the company consolidated everything into Studebaker's South Bend plant. And from that point forward, the car wearing the Packard name was not a Packard in any meaningful sense. It was a Studebaker with a different badge and a few cosmetic changes, and some people at the company knew it and hated it and said so internally. The fans noticed immediately. They had a name for it and they weren't wrong. They called it the Packard-Baker, and the contempt in that word captured exactly what it felt like to see the nameplate on something that wasn't the real thing. Here's what makes it worse though, and nobody talks about this part enough: there were actual Packard blueprints. Real engineering documents, design plans, development work that the team had been building toward before the merger consumed everything. A genuine next-generation Packard that could have re-established the brand in the luxury space, that could have given Nance the weapon he came there to build. Those blueprints got shelved. Not revisited later, not mothballed for a future moment, shelved in the way that happens when there's no money and no time and the company is now in survival mode for a brand that isn't even yours. Imagine being an engineer who worked on those plans. Imagine knowing what you had drawn was real and viable and then watching it become paper in a filing cabinet while the name you worked for got stuck on something you didn't build and wouldn't have been proud of. By 1957 the situation was beyond saving and everyone involved knew it. Nance had already left. The people who cared about what Packard actually was had already left or were leaving. What remained was a company trying to extract whatever value was left from a name that was being spent faster than it could be replenished. The 1957 Packard was a Studebaker with trim. The 1958 Packard, the last one, for cars were produced, and they were sent out with so little ceremony that there was no announcement, no final edition, no acknowledgement of what was ending. A brand that had built cars for presidents and powered the aircraft that protected democracy just stopped, not with a moment, not with anything that honored what it had been, just stopped. And here's what genuinely gets to me when I sit with this story. Packard didn't die because the car got bad first. It didn't die because customers rejected it on its merits. It died because a merger was structured around information that wasn't accurate, because the financial health of a partner company was presented in a way that didn't match reality, because the cash and engineering resources of a genuinely great company got absorbed into keeping something else alive. The blueprint wasn't just the engineering documents on those shelved plans, it was the entire vision Nance carried in when he took the job, the version of Packard that could have existed, that by every measure of the company's history and capability deserved to exist, and it got used up before it ever got built. What you're left with is this question, and I actually want you to think about it. If the merger had been structured honestly, if Studebaker's real numbers had been on the table from day one, does Packard survive? And I think the honest answer most automotive historians land on is yes. Not guaranteed, the independent market was brutal in that era, but yes, a well-funded Packard with its identity restored and its engineering team intact had a real path. There were buyers for what a genuine 1958 or 1959 Packard could have been. The demand for American luxury that wasn't just Cadillac absolutely existed. Lincoln was finding it. A real Packard could have found it. Instead, those buyers went to Cadillac or Lincoln, and Packard became a cautionary tale that most people today don't even know enough to tell correctly. The thing that makes vintage Packard collectors so passionate, and I've talked to people who restore these cars and the feeling they describe is almost grief-adjacent, is that you can still see in the actual cars, the real ones from the 30s and 40s and early 50s, exactly what this brand was capable of. You sit in a 1941 Packard 180 and the quality is not nostalgia, it's not you being sentimental about old things, it's genuinely there in the material and the engineering and the way it was built to last rather than built to a price point. That's the ghost that follows the story. Not what Packard became at the end, but what it was in the middle, and the very specific, very human sequence of decisions that turned a crown jewel into a cautionary story. The final blueprint was never built. The company that could have built it got its resources redirected into a merger that was sold on numbers that weren't real. And the name that survived a depression and powered a world war couldn't survive a boardroom decision in South Bend, Indiana. That's the slow death of an American legend, and honestly the fact that we still talk about Packard at all, that collectors still hunt these cars, that restorers still spend years getting them right, might be the only version of justice the story ever got.